Section 2. Land use and land rights. The subject of land has long been important to artistic production. In a basic sense, land is the source of the materials for much artistic production. The materials mixed together and applied to a canvas stretched upon wood and bars is the basis of modern painting, while materials of clay, stone, and wood have long been common to sculpture, particularly in painting. Depictions of land became especially important during the modern era when Dutch artists, beginning in the 17th century, began to depict the lands of the Dutch Republic as the main subject of paintings, rather than the background. Such landscape painting soon became popular throughout the Romantic period in places like Germany, England, and the United States, where artists including Caspar David Friedrich, John Constable, and Thomas Cole experimented with new techniques for showing the uniqueness of their lands and in some cases highlighting national characteristics of their home territories. In the United States in particular, landscape paintings of the West were harnessed to manifest destiny. The 19th century cultural belief that American settlers were divinely predestined to take possession of the entire east to west expanse of the North American continent. Implicit in manifest destiny was the idea that the lands of the western United States were empty of culture and history, a position that not only devalued native peoples and their cultures but disregarded their existence entirely. The imperial drive of manifest destiny caused both severe displacement and mass killing of the indigenous inhabitants of the West. The more contemporary artists discussed in the section that follows do not reject the history of representing landscape, but instead re-engage those traditions within the framework of political and environmental issues, whereas the Euro-American landscape tradition in painting often highlighted that which was beautiful or picturesque in the land. Picturesque. Among the Sierra Nevada, California, 1868, by Albert Bierstadt. In the U.S., landscape paintings of the West were harnessed to a cultural belief that American settlers were divinely predestined to take possession of the entire east to west expanse of the North American continent, meaning a view worthy of being seen and appreciated as a picture. The work of contemporary artists underscores the notion that the unseen or unappreciated aspects of land are just as vital, if not more so, than the picturesque. One theme that links the four artworks in this section of the resource guide is an interrogation of the forces that divide and separate lands from their inhabitants. Some of these works investigate military occupation. Others examine the occupation of colonial settlers. Both of these cases remind us that there is no divide on this earth between lands that are occupied and lands that are wild. All lands have a present and historical relationship to both nature and culture. Please note, the following section employs the terms indigenous, Native American First Nations, Aboriginal and Indian, in different contexts. These terms all describe the different peoples and cultures of the inhabitants of the territory now called North America, prior to European colonization. Indigenous is a commonly used term today that describes people whose culture originates from a particular place and is not specific to North America. Native American describes cultures that originated in North America. This term gained popularity through political movements in the 1960s and 1970s. It, however, remains politically charged because the term America itself originates from the early modern era of European colonial settlement and map-making. First Nations is a term commonly used in Canada, which recognizes the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. It describes Indigenous peoples of Canada, who ethnically are neither Métis nor Inuit. Aboriginal refers to the first inhabitants of a territory, and, in practice, is more common in Canada than the United States. Indian is a term thought to derive from Christopher Columbus's mistaken impression that he had landed in South Asia, rather than the Americas. Due to this history and its subsequent use, Indian also remains a politically vexed term, but unlike many of the other names above, it carries legal standing in the United States, such as with the federal recognition of Indian tribes. Selected work, Elora Ann Calzadilla, Landmark, Footprints, 2002. Elora Ann Calzadilla is the name used by Jennifer Elora and Guillermo Calzadilla for their artistic partnership, which creates artwork through collaboration. Elora was born in Philadelphia in 1974 and was educated at the University of Richmond, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and the Independent Study Program at New York's Whitney American Art Museum. Calzadilla was born in 1971 in Havana, Cuba, and was educated at the Escuela de Artes Plásticas y Diseño de Puerto Rico, Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, and Bard College. The artists met while studying abroad in Florence in 1995 and began a collaboration that utilizes various media encompassing sculpture, performance, photography, video, and sound art. Today, they live and work in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Jennifer Elora, left, and Guillermo Calzadilla at Listen Gallery in New York City. Credit, Meron Tiki Ming Histad for the New York Times. Landmark, Footprints, is part of an extended series of artworks that Elora and Calzadilla have created about land use on the island of Vieques, Puerto Rico. A series is a group of artworks made around a particular theme or subject. During the Second World War, the United States military took possession of Vieques as a location to store and test weapons. Residents of the island whose lives had been disrupted and environmentally harmed by the military occupation organized a civil disobedience campaign that began in the 1970s, led by members of the Vieques Fishermen's Association. 1. This tension was heightened further still in 1999, when on April 19 a fighter pilot and ground control officer accidentally killed a security guard after the pilot selected an incorrect target on the ground and dropped two 500-pound bombs within feet of David Sanes Rodriguez, killing him instantly. 4 others were injured as well. 2. That same year, Elora and Calzadilla started to make artworks to raise awareness of the military occupation of Vieques, and they joined other activists in attempting to end it. For landmark footprints, Elora and Calzadilla joined civil disobedience groups in trespassing onto the bombing range on Vieques, an action that would trigger a heat sensor on the bombing range and effectively cease active explosions for the period that the protesters remained on site. For these visits, the artists created custom-made shoes to be worn by themselves and other protesters, on the soles of which had been printed messages and pictures laser-cut onto a plexiglass form. These included messages in both English and Spanish, such as "No more chemical and biological weapons on our land," and "Grande es el imperio que desafiamos, pero más grande es el derecho a la libertad." Great is the empire we challenge, but greater is our right to liberty. 3. The works with images included a map of Vieques, with 2 large X's, one over an ammunition storage area on the western side of the island and another over the bombing range on the eastern side. U.S. Navy vehicles on a beach at Camp Garcia, Vieques. Others depicted the weapons themselves, and others showed symbols of peace. One was a picture of the astronaut Buzz Aldrin landing on the moon as part of the Apollo 11 space mission, rather than celebrating the U.S. space program, like artist Alma Thomas, whose work will be discussed in the final section of this guide, had done decades earlier. Elora and Calzadilla's invocation of Apollo 11 was intended to note what the artists perceived to be the expansive colonial activities of the United States. In the context of landmark, the picture records the reach of the U.S. government beyond the bounds of our planet, as witnessed by astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong having planted a U.S. flag on the moon. Elora and Calzadilla photographed the imprints that these custom-designed soles left upon the sand during their protest, and they display their artwork via 2 sets of 12 printed photographs. The 2 sets can be displayed separately. The photograph included in your art reproductions booklet is drawn from the second of those collections, whereas the footprints noted in the title of this work identify a specific imprint made within Elora and Calzadilla's larger group of landmark activities. The phrase landmark itself is a poignant play on words. On the one hand, it describes the actual activity of marking land, something that the U.S. Navy had done through detonating weapons on Vieques, and the artists and other protesters had done more gently, through words and pictures that would blow away and disappear with the weather. Landmark footprints, fashions, forms and images that are purposefully fleeting and do not alter or impact their environment in the long run. This approach is like that taken by Ana Mendieta in her Saluda series, which we will discuss in the final section of this guide. As such, the title of Elora and Calzadilla's artwork is also a play on words with the term landmark. When written as landmark, with no space between the words, this term refers to a prominently visible object within a landscape that allows travelers to establish their location. Human-made landmarks, such as the Eiffel Tower in Paris or the Statue of Liberty in New York, tend to occupy their site with long-term constructions and are in physical standing. In contrast, landmark footprints sought to remove a permanent occupant of Vieques with marks that were more short-lasting, low to the ground, and less destructive in nature. In response to continuing protests of its occupation of Vieques, the U.S. military began to close the site in 2001 and left entirely in 2003. The end of weapons testing and the departure of the military, however, did not immediately repair the long-term damage that had been done to the island. Likewise, Elora and Calzadilla did not cease their engagement with Vieques after the creation of landmark footprints and the departure of the U.S. Navy. Their 2005 work under discussion, for instance, is a 6-minute video that shows a fisherman driving an upside-down table with a motor attached to the back around the island. Elora and Calzadilla were interested in the metaphor of a table as an object that brings together people for a discussion, but when upturned, such an object also communicates dysfunction. The man in the video circles a traditional path for fishing in Vieques, which then included large craters from exploded bombs and signs indicating the presence of other explosives that had never detonated. The path of the fisherman, like that of footprints, is yet another way of marking the land in a manner that leaves no permanent trace. 4. Describing their larger project landmark, Elora and Calzadilla pose a series of questions to provoke thought, rather than provide answers. These questions include: U.S. Navy officials dismantling makeshift buildings erected by protesters 6666. How is land differentiated from other land by the way it is marked? Who decides what is worth preserving and what should be destroyed? What are the strategies for reclaiming marked land? How does one articulate an ethics and politics of land use? 5. Selected work. Kent Monkman, The Fourth World, 2012. Kent Monkman was born in 1965 in St. Mary's, Ontario, Canada. He identifies as a Cree artist and is a member of the Fisher River Cree Nation, working across painting, film, video, performance, and installation. He is one of the most prominent and widely recognized Indigenous North American artists working today. His artworks address histories of colonization and Indigenous culture. Monkman's Fourth World, like many of his paintings, both appropriates the artwork of other artists and blurs the time periods of cultural encounters. Appropriation is an artistic technique in which one artist strategically uses the Kent Monkman as a Cree artist who is one of the most form of another artwork to give it new meaning. Prominent and widely recognized Indigenous North American. The term began to be commonly used in the 1980s. Artists working today day at which time artists such as Sherry Levine showed photo by Ryan Vanderhout photographs that had been taken of other photographs, rather than live subjects. Although a Levine image might look identical to that of an earlier, modern photographer like Walker Evans, their two photographs communicate differently because of the time in which they were made, the identity of the artist, and their intention in making the work. In the case of Monkman's Fourth World, two well-known artistic traditions are cited: 19th-century American Romantic landscape painting and 20th-century site-specific sculpture. Monkman depicts three blonde-haired male figures, two on horseback and one waving his camouflage shirt wildly above his head, corralling a small herd of bison, or, as they are commonly called, buffalo, through two curved walls set beneath the Yosemite Falls. The depiction of the famed waterfall in what is now Yosemite National Park is based on a painting titled Choluk, the Yosemite Fall from 1864 by the German-born American painter Albert Bierstadt. 6. Alongside contemporaries such as Thomas Moran and Thomas Hill, Bierstadt was part of an influential group of American artists who traveled throughout the western United States in the late 19th century, painting dramatic vistas of mountains and waterfalls to be displayed back in the East. These large-scale paintings showed the American West to be a landscape of fantastic drama and beauty, drawing upon the conventions of European Romanticism to stir interest among the American public in expanding the land claimed by the United. Albert Bierstadt's 1864 painting Choluk, the Yosemite Falls, dates all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Associated serves as source material for Monkman's The Fourth World with the doctrine of manifest destiny. These paintings also played a direct role in convincing members of Congress to dedicate national park lands to protect the kind of environments shown by Bierstadt. The romantic tradition of American landscape paintings of the West had the effect of protecting places like Yosemite National Park from large-scale settlement. However, the occupation and governance of those same lands by the United States government also brutally displaced their indigenous inhabitants, many of whom were either killed directly or worked to death as part of the massacre of indigenous populations across the 19th century, now often referred to as the California Genocide. None of the Miwok peoples who lived on that land in 1864 are shown in Monkman's painting or in Bierstadt's original, which only shows two groups. One group of white pioneers gathered around a campfire and a second group seen by the water on horseback. Fourth World instead depicts contemporary men playing Indian, which is to say, performing their own appropriation of indigenous cultural practice for personal enjoyment. They each wear green camouflage, which from head to toe remains a means for hunters to disguise themselves in the wild. Although when worn topless, the camouflage becomes more of a fashion statement, aligning its wearer with the mass popularization of military style. The fact that these cultural appropriations are all shown in the same space emphasizes that the history Monkman paints is decidedly complicated. For example, the horses that these men ride, and which became deeply associated with Native Americans during this period of the Wild West, were themselves an animal that had been introduced to North America by European colonists beginning in the 16th century. The second artistic appropriation in Monkman's painting is the copper-colored walls through which the bison run. They are a copy of the artwork Clara Clara, 1983, by the American artist Richard Serra. The color itself is not copper, but the weathered color of rusted Corten steel, a material preferred by Serra for his large-scale, site-specific sculpture. First associated with the post-minimalism movement of the late 1960s, Serra worked alongside the land art movement to establish site specificity as a key element of his outdoor sculpture. In fact, Serra has been uniquely influential in solidifying the idea of site specificity for Art Buffalo being chased off a cliff, painted by Alfred Jacob Miller. Historians as a result of a contentious public in the late 19th century. Traditionally Native American hearings surrounding his work tilted arc in the hunters would use natural land formations, like two narrow 1980s, originally installed in lower Manhattan cliffs, to direct bison for slaughter. In 1981, using public funds, Tilted Arc was cast in controversy following complaints from a small number of federal white-collar workers employed in the area. As a result, a hearing was organized to discuss relocating the sculpture. Despite Serra's adamant testimony that moving the sculptural element of Tilted Arc was tantamount to negating its site specificity and therefore the work as a whole, the sculptural element was removed from its site in 1989, prompting Serra to declare that his work had been destroyed. 7. Clara Clara was also similarly moved. It had been created for the Beaubourg area of Paris but was moved to Paris's Tuileries Garden for the exhibition Monument 2008. Rather than including Clara Clara as only an abstract sculpture, Monkman deploys it in the Fourth World as a buffalo jump. Traditionally Native American hunters would use natural land formations, like two narrow cliffs, to direct bison for slaughter. The presence of Clara Clara in Monkman's painting similarly invokes an impending slaughter, alluding to the mass killing of bison that took place across the 19th century to the point that the animals were on the brink of extinction. 9. At once utterly frank about the seizure of lands in the American West and the mass killing of indigenous people and animals alike across the 19th century, Monkman's painting is also purposefully impossible. It is an image that plays upon the different ways in which it seems realistic because of the many incorrect assumptions that the general public still holds about the differences and unique cultural practices of specific indigenous communities. As Monkman has commented, the more I looked at art of the 19th century going backwards in time, the more I realized that those paintings of that time were a manifesto, this visual manifesto of colonization, and this was the visual record. This was the European's imagination of what he saw North America being and how he saw himself taking ownership of it and how he saw the Aboriginal people relating to himself but also to landscape. 10. Similar to Will Wilson's critique of Edward Curtis's stereotyped photographs of Native Americans, which we will discuss shortly, the work by Monkman invokes George Catlin's earlier paintings of the 19th century documenting and effectively typecasting Native subjects. This diminishing of culture and its ability to thrive connects with the phrase Fourth World that Monkman includes in the title of his painting. Following the more common nomenclature of First World, Second World, and Third World, the Fourth World refers to cultures that are without their own sovereignty because they are forced to exist within another political nation. It is a problem at the heart of the impossibilities depicted in the Fourth World. Selected work, Bonnie Devine, Battle for the Woodlands, 2014-15. Bonnie Devine was born in Toronto, Ontario, Canada in 1952. She is an Indigenous installation artist, curator, writer, and educator, and member of the Serpent River First Nation of Northern Ontario, Anishinaabe Ojibwe.11. She studied art at the Ontario College of Art and Design University, OCAD, and earned a Master of Fine Arts, MFA from York University in 1999. Since 2008, she has taught at OCAD and served as founding chair of its Indigenous Visual Culture program. Devine's early site-specific installations include Reclamation Project, which consisted quite simply of a strip of sod that she draped across different landscapes in southern Ontario. As Devine explains, Bonnie Devine is an Indigenous installation artist, curator, writer, educator, and member of the Serpent River First Nation of Northern Ontario, Anishinaabe Ojibwe. I made Reclamation Project in response to image courtesy ago the Ipperwash crisis, an Ontario provincial police action against an Indigenous protest at Camp Ipperwash in the Kettle and Stony Point First Nation in September 1995, during which an Anishinaabe protester Dudley George was shot and killed by the police. In an effort to comment on the land claim and standoff at Camp Ipperwash, I installed 6 rolls offset at various sites, for 10 minutes or so, just long enough for me to take a Polaroid picture. 12. The first site was a gravel road that adjoins 2 fields in the Lynn Shores Conservation Area. In another site, the sod adorned the front steps of a sizable health institute in downtown Toronto. In each case, the fleetingness of the sod's placement served to highlight the difference in timescales of colonial land claims in present-day Ontario and Devine's own reclamation of such lands. As with the ephemeral site performances by Rebecca Belmore and Anna Mendieta that we will discuss later in the guide, Devine's work didn't seek the status of being permanent to its site or of possessing it. Devine's work resists the notion that sites should or even can be possessed. Another of Devine's earlier works includes techniques of sewing to examine and sustain those traditional art-making techniques of Anishinaabe Ojibwe culture. In Canoe of 2003, Devine stitched together hundreds of pages of paper from her MFA thesis to form a 16-foot canoe, which she displayed suspended from the ceiling. She displayed Canoe as part of a larger, multimedia installation titled Stories from the Shield, which also included drawings, rocks and tree stumps that Devine wrapped in silk threads, and video depicting her family members discussing the negative effects that uranium mining has had on the Serpent River First Nation. This connection between the cultural practices of the Serpent River First Nation and the environmental and political difficulties it has suffered through the occupation of its lands is further discussed in the pages of Devine's thesis. As the art historian Cynthia Fowler describes, the pages from Devine's thesis include descriptions of traditional canoe technology, which the artist followed in spirit when making her own canoe. The 1850 Robinson-Huron Treaty, originated by the Canadian government to control the northern shores of Lake Huron in large part for the purpose of developing the mining industry, and documentation of Devine's research on the 1950s uranium mining debacle described by her family members in the video. 13. In all, Devine's interests in bringing together Indigenous art-making practices, collective memory, and environmental impact through multimedia installations can be followed through to her more recent exhibition Battle for the Woodlands. Devine created Battle for the Woodlands over the period from 2014-15 for display in its own room in the Art Gallery of Ontario, including freestanding sculptures made from maple and willow trees and decorated moose and buffalo hides. The work is anchored by a 19th-century colonial map of the border region between Upper Canada, Lower Canada, and the United States. Over this map, which is cropped to include only 2 of the Great Lakes, Devine depicts the entire aquatic system of the 5 Great Lakes as 5 animals painted in red oxide: buffalo, otter, turtle, rabbit, and leviathan, in addition to showing clashes between British, American, and Indigenous peoples, and placing beads along borderlines once established by treaties that were later broken. As Devine has explained, I felt that no map of the eastern woodlands of North America should exclude its numinous and monumental heart, the Anishinaabe Cape. Anishinaabe women were known for life-giving waters of our home. I pictured them, their skillful beadwork and textile ornamentation, as spirit beings, for that is what they are. 14. A final element of the painting shows dozens of animals, including deer, bison, bear, and rabbits fleeing to the west. In her discussion of the artwork, Devine describes this migration as the catastrophic habitat loss also caused by colonial settlement. 15. Through all the elements of her installation, Devine shows the implications of forced occupation, not only on political borders, but also on the ecological life in the places where those military battles are staged and the communities settled in their aftermath. Writing about her earlier installation Stories from the Shield, Devine described her artistic project as follows: "In all of these works, my primary desire has been to examine and perhaps articulate the delicate yet elemental relationship of land to consciousness, especially as this is revealed in the technologies, designs, and narrative traditions of the Ojibwe." 16. This is a sentiment that aptly describes Battle for the Woodlands. One of the central elements to that consciousness about land is representation. The map with which Devine's painting began is one means of representing land that uses proper names not only to identify landmarks like rivers and lakes, but also to designate ownership, by nations such as the United States and Canada. By layering an opposing visual map over top of the colonial one, Devine invokes a different approach to imaging the territory that, as art historian Mark Cheetham has written, acknowledges the indigenous peoples who continue to experience displacement. 17. The colonial map draws divisions within territory, whereas Devine's representation of animals, water, land, and people in co-existence creates connection rather than separation. Selected work: Will Wilson, Church Rock Spill Evaporation Ponds, Church Rock, New Mexico, Dineta, 2019. Will Wilson is a contemporary Diné Navajo artist. After spending the formative years of his life on Dineta, the traditional homeland of the Navajo people, which is called the Navajo Nation under U.S. law, Wilson studied photography, sculpture, and art history at Oberlin College, earning a bachelor's degree in studio art and art history in 1993, and at the University of New Mexico, where he was awarded a Master of Fine Arts degree in 2002. Formerly the head of photography at Santa Fe Community College, he is presently a professor of art at the University of Texas at Austin. Church Rock Spill Evaporation Ponds is part of a photographic series Wilson calls Survey. In this project, he documents contaminated lands within and on the border of Dineta that remain polluted as a result of various environmentally harmful extraction activities carried out by the United States government and private American companies, from the 1940s until the 1980s. During a period in which the U.S. stockpiled nuclear weapons, approximately 4 million tons of uranium ore were extracted from mines on the lands of the Navajo Nation. 18. Church Rock Spill is an aerial view, meaning that it is a photographic image shot from above, in the sky. Its subject is two ponds used to evaporate. Will Wilson is a contemporary Diné Navajo artist. Water contaminated with tailings, which is a radioactive waste product from uranium mining that contains heavy metals and radium. It is pumped from the mine into a pond for storage. When that pond is full, it is allowed to evaporate in the sun until dry, at which time its toxic liner is removed and replaced. On July 16, 1979, the dam holding contaminated water at the Church Rock uranium mill breached, releasing more than 93 million gallons of radioactive liquid into the Puerco River, traveling 80 miles downstream to Navajo County, Arizona, and onto the Navajo Nation. It remains the largest radioactive spill in U.S. history. In her book about the disaster, Judy Pasternak described its immediate effects. The water, filled with acids from the milling process, twisted a metal culvert in the Puerco and burned the feet of a little boy who went wading. Sheep keeled over and died, and crops curdled along the banks. The surge of radiation was detected as far away as Sanders, Arizona, 50 miles downstream. 19 years later, representatives of the Navajo Nation spoke at a congressional hearing to detail the remaining hazards still lingering on site. These have since been acknowledged by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, which recognized in a 2014 report that Navajo people continue to live with the environmental and health effects from mining operations. More than 500 abandoned mines are located across the reservation, some close to homes and communities, and an unknown number of homes and drinking water sources contain radioactive elements. 20. Although the Church Rock spill occurred less than 4 months after 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, and was larger, it was vastly underreported in comparison to the earlier disaster. As such, Wilson's photograph of the tailing ponds in 2019 continues to bring this event into public view and remind the public that the toxicity of the spill remains on the land. Sites like Church Rock in the sparsely populated desert regions of the American West have been selected for toxic A sign placed by the New Mexico environmental improvement activities like uranium mining and nuclear weapons. Division discouraging use of the Puerco River, testing throughout the 20th and 21st centuries because of the perception that they were non-living spaces that were not populated. Desert ecosystems, however, are very much alive, and the impact of mining can be felt by populations of people who live many miles away from the actual site of extraction. In selecting sites local to Dineta for survey, Wilson's photographic series emphasizes this very point, that the polluted lands depicted in his photographs were not unpopulated. Further, the activities of the military and mining industries have perpetuated a false assumption that the indigenous peoples of North America exist only in the past, having disappeared when the West was settled under manifest destiny. More pointedly, Wilson has identified the perpetuation of this false narrative through the practice of an earlier, 20th century photographer named Edward S. Curtis, who widely exhibited stereotyped portraits of Native American subjects. In Wilson's words, as an indigenous artist working in the 21st century, employing media that range from historical photographic processes to the randomization and projection of complex visual systems within virtual environments, I am impatient with the way that American culture remains enamored of one particular moment in a photographic exchange between Euro-American and Aboriginal American societies. The decades from 1907 to 1930 when photographer Edward S. Curtis produced the North American Indian. For many people even today, Native people remain frozen in time in Curtis photos. I propose to create a body of photographic inquiry that will stimulate a critical dialogue and reflection around the historic and contemporary photographic exchange as it pertains to Native Americans. My aim is to convene indigenous artists, art professionals and government leaders, as well as the general public, to engage in the performative ritual that is the studio portrait. 21. One of Wilson's artistic responses to Curtis's project for the broad perception of Native American identity was to create his own portraits in a studio setting using the traditional technique of large-format wet plate collodion photographs. The wet plate collodion technique creates a glass plate negative measuring 8 inches by 10 inches in the camera. Prints made from the glass plate negative are very high in detail and quality, in comparison to photographs printed from the smaller, modern technology of 35mm negatives. On his personal, artist's website, Wilson displays dozens of reproductions of these portrait photographs, emphasizing the uniqueness of each subject, sometimes shown alone, sometimes with a partner, or other family members, resisting the notion that all indigenous subjects belong to a precast and predictable type. Wilson's portraits seek to humanize pictures of people who historically have been dehumanized. In this way, Wilson's approach is akin to the photographic projects of LaToya Ruby Frazier, who we will discuss in the final section of the resource guide. As a final note, we also might consider Wilson's title survey for his series. Based on the definition of this term in Merriam-Webster's dictionary, Wilson's project would seem to appropriately fit multiple definitions of a survey: a verb, to examine as to condition, situation, or value, to determine and delineate the form, extent, and position of, such as a tract of land, and to view or consider comprehensively. 22. While appropriate descriptions of his work, these contemporary definitions do not capture the historical resonance of the surveys carried out in the work of 19th-century American photographers, including Timothy O'Sullivan and Arthur Schott, each of whom developed specific photographic techniques to render the lands and native peoples of the American West as information, which could then be processed and used by the United States government. 23. As with his portraits, Wilson's photographs of contaminated lands and data situate present-day conditions in the memories and ongoing repercussions of the past. Section 2 Summary 6 Prior